When the frosted glass door swung open and Marcus Stone found himself staring at Elena Harrington, half dressed in her corner office, he knew his life was about to change. The tool bag slipped from his fingers and crashed against marble floor, shattering the profound silence that existed only in spaces where powerful people made decisions that changed lives without ever seeing the faces of those affected. The fluorescent light in Marcus's bathroom had been dying for 3 weeks, but he couldn't bring himself to fix it. Not because he didn't know how he'd rewired half the building where he worked, but because every time he looked at that burnt-out bulb, he saw another bill. He couldn't pay another promise to his daughter Ivy that he'd have to break. 3 hours earlier, the light had stuttered on at 4:47 in the morning, casting shadows across his face as he splashed cold water against his skin and stared at the stranger in the mirror. 24 years old, and he looked 40. The lines around his eyes told stories he wished he could forget, and the calluses on his hands were a roadmap of every job he'd worked to keep a roof over their heads. Behind him, through the thin walls of their cramped Seattle apartment in Capitol Hill, he could hear Ivy breathing softly in her sleep, that gentle rhythm that was the only music that mattered anymore. He'd been 18 when everything fell apart. One positive pregnancy test, one screaming match, one door slamming as Jessica walked out of his life before Ivy even took her first breath. The memory still cut like fresh glass even after 6 years. She'd been 7 months pregnant, standing in the doorway of the apartment. They couldn't afford her face set in that expression he'd learned meant her mind was already made up. Her voice had been cold and final. "I'm not ready to be a mother. You figure it out." And he had. Somehow, impossibly, he had. 6 years of night classes at trade school while working construction during the day, abandoned dreams of engineering school packed away in boxes he couldn't afford to store. Every ambition, every possibility, every version of himself that might have been all of it, sacrificed at the altar of diapers and daycare formula and rent keeping one small human alive and safe in a world that didn't care if you were drowning. The electrician's certification had taken 2 years working with hands that shook from exhaustion, studying wiring diagrams, while Ivy slept in her secondhand crib. At 20, he'd finally gotten his license. At 21, Harrington Technologies had hired him for basement maintenance, unclogging drains, replacing light bulbs, invisible work for invisible wages. 3 years of proving himself, moving from the sub-basement to general maintenance, then finally to electrical specialist. It still wasn't enough. Marcus pulled on his work shirt, navy blue with Harrington Technologies maintenance embroidered over the pocket, and grabbed his tool belt from the hook by the door. In Ivy's room, he knelt beside her narrow bed and brushed a strand of dark hair from her forehead. She stirred but didn't wake her small hand curling around the stuffed rabbit he'd found at a thrift store for her 5th birthday. Tomorrow she'd ask again why she didn't have new shoes like the other kids at school, and his heart would break a little more, knowing he'd failed her in yet another small way that would add up over time into something he couldn't fix with a multimeter and a wire stripper. The letter from her teacher was hidden in his work bag, words he'd read 3 times already burning themselves into his memory. Ivy has been experiencing bullying from classmates regarding her worn clothing and shoes. Please contact me to discuss. The shoes cost $80. He had $43 in his checking account, and rent was due in 5 days. A soft knock at the door announced Eleanor Hayes, their 70-year-old neighbor who watched Ivy most mornings in exchange for help with her leaking sink and broken cabinet hinges. It was a fragile arrangement held together with favors and goodwill, but it was all he had. Eleanor's weathered face creased into a smile as she slipped inside, moving with the practiced quiet of someone who understood what it meant to stretch every dollar until it screamed. Her eyes, sharp despite their age, took in the dark circles under Marcus's eyes, the way his shoulders carried weight that had nothing to do with his tool bag. She'd been the first person to hold Ivy after Jessica left, the one who'd shown him how to change a diaper, how to soothe a crying infant when panic threatened to swallow him whole. She'd never asked for anything in return, though Marcus fixed everything in her apartment that broke, and some things that didn't, just to feel less useless. Marcus's phone buzzed at 5:03. His stomach dropped even before he looked at the screen. Early calls were never good news. Tom Brennan's voice belonged to the day shift supervisor, and he sounded harried, the kind of stress that came from problems rolling downhill faster than anyone could catch them. The words hit like a physical blow. "Sullivan, I need you to handle an emergency call, executive floor, electrical issue in the CEO's private office wing." Marcus's hand tightened around the phone. The executive floor, and it was 23 stories above his usual territory, a world of marble and mahogany that maintenance staff entered only when absolutely necessary. He'd been up there exactly twice in 3 years, both times to fix urgent problems, while the executives were safely away at lunch or in meetings. The unspoken rule was simple: be invisible, be quick, and don't make eye contact. His voice came out rougher than intended, betraying the fear already coiling in his gut. Can't Rodriguez take it? I'm not scheduled until 7. And I've got to drop. Tom cut him off with the impatience of a man who'd already had this conversation 3 times. Rodriguez called in sick. Stevens is handling a flood in the parking garage. You're the only one with electrical clearance who's answering their phone. The words softened slightly, though the urgency remained. I know it's early, Marcus. I know you've got the kid, but this came from the top. CEO herself requested immediate response. Elena Harrington. Even her name carried weight that made the phone feel heavier in Marcus's hand. Everyone at Harrington Technologies knew the stories. 28 years old and already running a tech empire her father had built over 4 decades. She'd taken over 2 years ago when Harrison Harrington suffered a stroke, and the business world had waited for her to fail. Instead, she'd streamlined operations, acquired 3 competitors, and doubled the company's value. The financial press called her a prodigy. The employees called her the Ice Queen, and not with affection. Marcus had seen her exactly once, moving through the lobby like a force of nature in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than his rent. She hadn't looked left or right, hadn't acknowledged the people who stepped aside to let her pass. Her face had been perfectly composed, beautiful in a way that seemed deliberately weaponized: sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that missed nothing, mahogany hair pulled back in a style that suggested control over every detail. She'd terrified him from 50 feet away. The thought of being in the same room with her made his hands sweat. Marcus heard himself agreeing, the word fine tasting like ash in his mouth. Tom's relief was palpable, even through the phone line, followed by the correction that made Marcus's chest tighten further. 30 minutes. The email said urgent, whatever that means when it comes from Elena Harrington. Marcus ended the call and stood motionless in his tiny kitchen, the dying light from the bathroom flickering overhead like a warning. He couldn't afford to lose this job. Not with Ivy's school fees coming due, not with the landlord already circling about last month's late payment. The numbers ran through his head, unbidden, the same calculation he performed every morning: $68,000 per year, divided by 12 minus taxes, minus rent, minus daycare, minus food, minus emergencies that always came exactly when he couldn't handle them. The math never worked out in his favor. He'd go to the executive floor, fix whatever needed fixing, and disappear back into the basement where he belonged. Simple, safe, survivable. The bus ride to Harrington Tower took 25 minutes through streets still dark with pre-dawn shadows. Marcus watched the city wake up through smeared windows, delivery trucks unloading, coffee shops flickering to life, other people stumbling toward their own obligations and compromises. He wondered how many of them felt like they were drowning, too, just trying to keep their heads above water one more day. How many carried the weight of a small life, depending entirely on their ability to show up, function, provide. The thought offered no comfort. Harrington Tower rose 63 stories into the Seattle sky, all steel and glass, a monument to ambition that seemed to mock everyone who entered through the service entrance. The building gleamed even in the pre-dawn darkness windows, reflecting the city lights like 1,000 watching eyes. Marcus swiped his maintenance badge at the service entrance, the click of the lock releasing, feeling like a cell door closing behind him. The frayed elevator carried him up slowly, watching the numbers climb with a sense of dread that tightened around his chest. Basement levels, ground floor. The numbers kept rising, carrying him away from familiar territory into a realm where people made millions, while he scraped together enough for Ivy's lunch money. The executive floor was quiet at 5:38, that kind of profound silence that only existed in spaces designed to intimidate. Marcus's footsteps echoed on marble floors, so polished he could see his reflection, a ghost in work boots carrying a tool bag that seemed suddenly shabby against the backdrop of luxury. Abstract art lined the walls, pieces that probably cost more than he'd earn in 5 years. Conference rooms made entirely of glass stood empty, their tables gleaming under recessed lighting that cost more per fixture than his monthly salary. Everything whispered the same message: you don't belong here. The CEO's wing occupied the corner of the building separated from the rest of the executive floor by a reception area that looked like something from an architecture magazine. The lights were indeed out, leaving the space dim, except for the gray wash of dawn creeping through floor-to-ceiling windows. Marcus found the electrical panel behind a mahogany door that blended seamlessly into the wall labeled in small, brass letters, "Authorized personnel only." He was authorized technically, though he'd never felt less like he belonged anywhere. His hands moved automatically through the familiar routine opening, the panel checking the circuits with his multimeter. The problem revealed itself immediately, a tripped breaker, probably from a power surge during the night. Simple fix, 5 minutes of work. He reset the breaker and heard the satisfying hum of electricity flowing through the system. Lights flickered on throughout the wing, and he allowed himself a moment of relief. Then he heard a voice from somewhere deeper in the office, sweet but sharp with frustration. Finally, what took so long? Marcus's stomach clenched. He'd assumed the floor would be empty this early, that he'd have the place to himself. The realization that Elena Harrington was already here, already working, while the rest of the city slept, made him want to disappear into the walls. His response came out carefully professional, loud enough to carry but not so loud as to seem aggressive. "Just needed to reset the breaker, ma'am. Everything should be working now. I'll just test the switches to make sure." Her voice came back clipped and impatient. "Do it quickly. I have a press conference in 2 hours and I need to change." Marcus moved through the reception area, testing light switches as he went. Each one responded perfectly, flooding the space with warm light that made the artwork glow in the marble gleam. He was thorough but fast, wanting nothing more than to finish and escape back to the maintenance levels where executives existed only as distant voices on intercom systems. The executive suite had three main areas: the reception space, a large conference room, and what had to be Elena's private office. Two of the three doors were open. The third, made of frosted glass that turned everything behind it into soft shadows, was closed. Marcus tested the switches outside the conference room, then moved toward the office. There was one more switch by the frosted door, a master control that probably operated the office lights. He flipped it, heard the click of response, and his hand was already on the door handle, pushing before his brain registered what he was doing. It was instinct, a maintenance worker's reflex after 3 years of checking, testing, verifying. His hand pushed the frosted glass inward. The door swung open. Elena Harrington stood in the center of her office, frozen in the act of pulling a fresh blouse from a garment bag. She wore a black skirt and nothing else above the waist except a bra so delicate it seemed barely there. Her mahogany hair was down, falling in waves across bare shoulders, and her dark eyes went wide with shock that matched the horror flooding through Marcus's veins. For one endless second, neither of them moved. The world compressed into that single moment, her skin pale against the dark fabric, the curve of her collarbone, the vulnerability of exposure, in someone who'd built an empire on never showing weakness. Time stretched and warped Marcus's mind, cataloging details he'd spend the rest of his life trying to forget: the way morning light slanted across her face, the visible pulse at her throat, the exact shade of her eyes as they widened in recognition of the violation, however unintentional. Then reality crashed back in with the force of a physical blow. The tool bag hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot, tools scattering across pristine marble. Marcus's mouth moved before his brain caught up, words tumbling out in a desperate rush that came from somewhere primal, somewhere that understood his entire life hung in the balance of the next 60 seconds. His voice cracked with panic. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I was just testing the lights. I didn't know, I didn't mean to." Her voice cut through his babbling like ice over steel, quiet but absolutely lethal. "Get out." The command froze him mid-apology, every muscle locking into place. Marcus backed away so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet, his face burning with humiliation, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. The door handle caught his tool bag, and he stumbled, catching himself against the door frame. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely control them as he scrambled to pick up scattered tools, shoving them back into the bag with clumsy, panicked movements. The words kept spilling out, each one another nail in his coffin. "The door. I thought it was empty. I was just checking the switches. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Elena's voice came again, each word precise and controlled. "Turn around." The command stopped him mid-retreat, and Marcus spun so fast he felt dizzy, facing the frosted glass. and the blurred shapes of the reception area beyond. Behind him, he heard the whisper of fabric, the sharp zip of the garment bag. Every muscle in his body was locked rigid, waiting for the explosion, the rage, the inevitable consequences of the worst mistake of his professional life. He'd walked in on Elena Harrington, half-dressed, the CEO, the woman who could end his career with a single phone call, the woman who held his entire fragile existence in her perfectly manicured hands. The image was burned into his retinas, no matter how tightly he squeezed his eyes shut. This was it. This was the moment his life split into before and after the fulcrum on which everything balanced and fell. Marcus's voice came out strangled, desperate. "I swear I didn't see anything. I swear I was just doing my job, testing the circuits. I didn't know you were in here. Please, I have a daughter. I need this job. The single word cut through his panic like a knife. "Be quiet." Marcus's jaw snapped shut with an audible click. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and panicked, and beneath it the soft sounds of Elena dressing. Seconds stretched into eternities. His entire body felt like a live wire crackling with fear and shame. The silence pressed down on him heavy, as water drowning him in possibilities each worse than the last. Fired definitely. Blacklisted probably. How would he explain to Ivy why they were being evicted, why Daddy couldn't find work anymore, why everything good had to end? When Elena finally spoke again, her voice was controlled, but carried something underneath that he couldn't quite identify. Not anger exactly, but something more complex, layered with calculations he couldn't begin to parse. The question came measured and careful. "What's your name?" Marcus answered, like a prisoner reciting his crimes. "Marcus Stone, ma'am. Maintenance staff, electrical clearance. I've worked here 3 years. I've never had a complaint. I swear this was an accident. I thought the office was empty. She interrupted with clinical precision. "I heard you the first time." The pause that followed felt like falling. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the frosted glass, watching blurred shapes move behind it as Elena finished dressing. His reflection stared back at him, pale and terrified, a man watching his life crumble in real time. The air tasted like copper and fear. When she spoke again, the words carried the weight of judgment being passed. "You can turn around now." Marcus turned slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor like a supplicant before royalty. Elena Harrington stood behind her desk, now fully dressed in a cream blouse and the same black skirt, her hair pulled back in the severe style he recognized from that glimpse in the lobby months ago. She looked every inch the CEO again, and all traces of vulnerability erased behind a mask of perfect control. But her dark eyes studied him with an intensity that made his skin prickle, cataloging him the way a scientist might study an interesting specimen, not with anger, but with something more unsettling. Assessment, evaluation. The weight of her gaze felt physical, pressing against him like atmospheric pressure. The command came soft but absolute. "Look at me." It was the hardest thing Marcus had ever done. Meeting Elena Harrington's gaze felt like staring into a searchlight, every flaw and weakness exposed under that merciless scrutiny. But he forced himself to do it, forced his eyes up from the floor to meet hers, because she deserved that much, at least an acknowledgement of what he'd done, an acceptance of whatever judgment she was about to deliver. Her face was unreadable, a mask of perfect control that gave away nothing. But something flickered in her eyes as she looked at him, something that wasn't the fury he'd expected. Curiosity, maybe, or calculation. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Her next words weren't what he expected. "You really didn't know I was here." It wasn't a question, but Marcus answered anyway, his voice rough and small. "No, ma'am, I swear. The work order just said electrical malfunction. I reset the breaker and I was testing all the switches. I thought the whole floor was empty this early." His hands were shaking again. He clenched them into fists at his sides, trying to still the tremor that betrayed just how close he was to complete collapse. The words kept coming tumbling out despite his best efforts to maintain some shred of dignity in the wreckage of this disaster. "I understand if you need to fire me. I understand I don't have any excuse. I just want you to know it was an accident. I would never." She cut him off with a raised hand. "Stop talking." Marcus stopped. Elena walked around her desk with measured steps, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor with the regularity of a metronome counting down to his execution. She stopped 3 feet away from him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive that made the air between them feel charged with electricity, dangerous and intoxicating in equal measure. The scent seemed to fill his lungs, making it hard to breathe, making everything feel surreal and distant. Her eyes searched his face like she was looking for something specific, some answer to a question he didn't know she was asking. The observation came clinical and detached. "You're terrified." Marcus managed a single word, "Yes." She pressed further still, watching him with that unsettling intensity. "Of me or of losing your job?" The truth fell out before he could stop it, raw and unfiltered. "Both. Mostly of losing my job. I have a daughter. She's 6. I'm all she has. I can't." His voice cracked and he forced himself to breathe, to push air past the constriction in his throat. The image of Ivy's face floated behind his eyes, her trust in him absolute and terrifying. What would he tell her? How could he explain that Daddy had destroyed their lives because he'd been careless, stupid, unforgivably unprofessional? The final admission came out barely above a whisper. "I can't afford to lose this." Elena's expression shifted, then something almost like recognition passing across her face there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. She studied him for another long moment, and Marcus felt like he was being weighed on scales he couldn't see, measured against criteria he couldn't begin to understand. The silence pressed down heavy and expectant. Then her shoulders straightened infinitesimally, a decision made, and when she spoke, her voice carried a finality that sounded almost gentle. "The door was unlocked. I should have secured it. That's on me, not you." Marcus blinked, certain he had heard wrong. The words didn't make sense. She was taking responsibility for his mistake. The cognitive dissonance made his head spin, reality tilting sideways in a way that felt more dangerous than her anger would have been. He opened his mouth to protest, to insist this was his fault, but she continued before he could form words. Her gaze remained steady, assessing. "You were doing your job, testing the electrical system. I was careless." Then came the words that would change everything, delivered with the casual authority of someone who shaped reality through sheer force of will. "What you saw stays between us. Understood?" Marcus's response came automatic and emphatic. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely. I would never say anything to anyone, I swear." Something in her posture relaxed fractionally, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "Good." She turned away, moving back to her desk with that same controlled grace, picking up a tablet, as if the last 5 minutes had been nothing more than a minor interruption to her morning routine. Her attention shifted to whatever waited in her schedule, and Marcus stood rooted to the spot, unable to process what was happening. She wasn't firing him. She wasn't even yelling at him. He'd braced for disaster and instead found something he didn't have a name for, something that felt almost like mercy, but tasted more complicated. The dismissal came matter of fact. "Finish your testing and get out. Send your supervisor a report that everything's functioning normally." Marcus stood frozen, his brain struggling to catch up with the sudden pivot from catastrophe to reprieve. The words he'd been preparing, the apologies, explanations, desperate pleas, all evaporated in the face of this unexpected outcome. She'd seen his terror, heard his desperation about Ivy, and she'd chosen mercy over the punishment he deserved. But why? The question burned in his mind, even as relief flooded through his limbs, making them weak and unsteady. The word escaped before he could stop it. "Ma'am." Elena looked up from her tablet, when one eyebrow raised in caution. Marcus's throat worked, trying to force out the inadequacy of language to express what he needed to say. Finally, the simplest truth emerged. "I really am sorry." For just a second, her mask slipped. So bishikamitat. What he saw underneath wasn't anger or ice or any of the things he'd expected. It was exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that recognized itself in another person. Her eyes held his, and in that moment, he saw something he'd never expected to see in Elena Harrington. Humanity, vulnerability, the weight of burdens she carried alone. The moment stretched between them, fragile and profound. Her voice came quieter than before, almost gentle. "I know you are." Then the professional mask slid back into place, seamless and complete. "Now go." Marcus grabbed his tool bag and fled, his legs unsteady as he escaped from the office. He tested the remaining switches with shaking hands, documented everything on his phone with fingers that could barely hold the device steady. The elevator ride back down felt like descending from a great height, his ears popping from pressure changes that had nothing to do with altitude. He made it to the maintenance break room before his knees gave out, sinking onto a metal folding chair and dropping his head into his hands. The adrenaline crash hit him like a physical wave, leaving him trembling and cold despite the warmth of the room. She'd let him go. She'd seen his terror, heard his desperation about Ivy, and she'd chosen not to destroy him. The why of it haunted him through the rest of his shift, through the mechanical routine of fixing broken things, while his mind spun in circles trying to understand what had just happened. 2 days passed in a haze of hypervigilance. Marcus reported for his shifts, kept his head down, and tried to convince himself the incident was behind him. The executive floor might as well have been on another planet. He fixed a leaking pipe in the fourth-floor bathroom, replaced fluorescent tubes in the second-floor conference room, unclogged a drain in the cafeteria. Invisible work for invisible people, the way it had always been. But something had shifted inside him, some fundamental understanding of his place in the world that he couldn't quite articulate. Elena Harrington had looked at him, really looked at him, and chosen not to crush him when she easily could have. That meant something, even if he couldn't figure out what. Thursday afternoon, his phone buzzed with a message from HR that made his stomach drop through the floor. Marcus Stone, please report to Human Resources immediately. Fourth floor, suite 400. This was it. They decided to fire him after all, probably wanted to do it officially with paperwork and witnesses. He should have known the reprieve was temporary, that someone like Elena Harrington wouldn't let something like this slide. The walk to HR felt like a death march, each step heavier than the last. Other employees passed him in the hallways, their faces cheerful, or stressed, or neutral, oblivious to the execution about to take place. Marcus's hands were sweating by the time he reached the fourth floor. The HR suite was all neutral colors and uncomfortable furniture designed to make difficult conversations slightly less awful. The receptionist barely looked up when Marcus gave his name, just gestured toward a conference room, where a woman in a gray pantsuit waited with a folder. Patricia Kemp, HR director, had the kind face of someone who'd delivered bad news so many times she'd learned to soften the blow. She gestured to a chair across from her, her expression professionally sympathetic in a way that made Marcus's chest tighten. This was really happening. After everything he'd survived, all the years of grinding himself down to nothing, to keep Ivy safe, it was ending because of one stupid mistake, one moment of carelessness that he'd replay in his mind for the rest of his life. His voice came out defensive, already trying to explain. If this is about Monday morning, I can explain. Patricia cut him off, her tone surprisingly gentle. This isn't disciplinary, Mr. Stone. She opened the folder and slid a document across the table, and Marcus stared at it, trying to force his brain to process what he was seeing. The words swam in front of his eyes, refusing to coalesce into meaning. Position transfer, executive floor, salary increase. The numbers didn't make sense. 68,000 to 127,000. Nearly double his current salary. Health insurance that covered dependents, which meant Ivy's dental work, the braces she'd need next year, the checkups he'd been putting off because the co-pays added up too fast. The words came out strangled. I don't understand. Patricia's expression remained professionally neutral as she explained, effective immediately, you're being reassigned from general maintenance to direct support technician for the executive floor. It's a permanent position with a significant salary increase and enhanced benefits package. Marcus's vision blurred. The numbers on the page swam. 127,000. He did the math automatically, unable to stop himself. 10,500 per month before taxes, maybe 7,000 after. Rent paid with room to spare. Groceries without anxiety. Ivy's shoes, new clothes, field trips, everything she needed and more. The dental work. The savings account he'd dreamed of but never managed to start. Breathing room. Space to exist without the constant pressure of drowning. His voice came out barely above a whisper. The position was created specifically based on a recommendation from Ms. Harrington herself. Patricia consulted her notes, professional and matter-of-fact. She indicated that the executive floor requires dedicated technical support with electrical expertise, and a pause as she checked the exact wording, demonstrated discretion and reliability under pressure. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Ms. Harrington recommended him. After everything that happened, after he'd violated her privacy in the most mortifying way possible, She'd not only chosen not to fire him, she'd promoted him. The salary was detailed on page 2. Health insurance that covered dependents, which Patricia noted specifically, acknowledging what she must have seen in his file. This was a good opportunity, she said, her professional demeanor softening slightly into something almost human. The executive floor position came with better hours, better benefits, direct exposure to company leadership. If he performed well, it could open doors. Doors. The word felt like a foreign language. Marcus looked down at the numbers again, at the promise of a life where he wasn't constantly calculating whether they could afford to eat out once a month, whether Ivy's growing feet could wait another month for new shoes. The health insurance would cover her dental work, the checkups he'd been putting off, the vision tests the school nurse had recommended. The hours meant he could drop her off at school every morning and pick her up every afternoon, actually see her during daylight, instead of kissing her goodbye while she slept and coming home after she'd already gone to bed. It was everything he needed, everything he'd been drowning for lack of, and it came from Elena Harrington. Patricia's voice brought him back to the present, efficient and expectant. Do you accept the position or not? What choice did he have? What choice had he ever had? Marcus heard himself accepting the word yes, coming from somewhere far away from the part of him that had learned to survive by taking what was offered and never questioning good fortune too closely. Patricia walked him through the paperwork: benefits, enrollment start date Monday morning, 7 a.m., report to the executive floor reception desk. Ms. Foster, Elena's assistant, would brief him on protocols and expectations. The words washed over him in a wave of administrative details that his brain couldn't quite process. He signed where Patricia indicated, initialing boxes and acknowledging terms he'd barely read, his hands moving on autopilot while his mind spun in circles. That evening, after Ivy had fallen asleep clutching her worn rabbit, Marcus pulled out his phone and navigated to the company intranet. Something had been nagging at him since the interview, a piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. He found the maintenance records, scrolled through the access logs, looking for something he wasn't even sure existed. Then he saw a time-stamped and undeniable personnel file: Marcus Stone, last accessed by E. Harrington. Date 4 weeks ago, a full month before the incident with the frosted door. She'd been looking at his file, researching him, evaluating him for something. This hadn't been a split-second decision made in the aftermath of an embarrassing accident. Elena Harrington had been watching him, considering him, before he ever walked into her office that morning. Marcus sat back against his threadbare couch, the phone screen glowing in the darkness of his living room. The timeline shifted, reconfiguring everything he thought he understood. She'd accessed his file 4 weeks ago. He tried to remember anything unusual from that time period, any interaction with executives or situations that might have drawn attention. Then it hit him. Thornton Building, floor 15, about 3 weeks before the incident. He'd been troubleshooting a complex HVAC failure, teaching a junior technician named Rodriguez how to diagnose sensor feedback loops. It had taken 3 hours, and he'd explained every step, drawn diagrams to make sure the kid understood not just what to do, but why. They'd been deep in the mechanical room, Marcus on his knees tracing wiring, while Rodriguez took notes when he'd looked up and seen a figure in the hallway. Just a shadow, really someone watching through the half-open door. He'd assumed it was building management doing rounds and hadn't given it another thought. But what if it had been her? What if Elena Harrington had been watching him work, listening to him teach, seeing something in that moment that made her pull his file and consider him for a position that didn't even exist yet? And then the incident happened, and instead of being the disaster that ended his career, it became a test of discretion under pressure, of character revealed in crisis. She'd seen him panic, heard his desperate mention of Ivy, watched him grovel and plead, and somehow, impossibly, that had been the final piece she needed to see. Marcus pulled up the acceptance email from Patricia and read through the job description again. Direct support technician for the executive floor, responsible for all electrical, HVAC, and general facility systems. Primary location, 23rd floor. Report directly to Tom Brennan, but with priority response to executive wing requests. The words took on new meaning, now revealing the shape of what Elena Harrington had created specifically for him. She needed someone with technical expertise, yes, but also someone who could be trusted with proximity to power. Someone who understood instinctively how to be invisible when necessary and present when needed. Someone who would keep his mouth shut about things he saw, things he heard, the daily machinery of running an empire that required absolute discretion. 3 days. He had 3 days before he stepped into a world where Elena Harrington would be a constant presence instead of a distant, terrifying legend. 3 days to figure out how to be invisible to someone who'd already seen right through him, who'd looked at his desperation and his fear, and chosen to help rather than destroy. The question that kept him awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his cramped apartment, while Ivy breathed softly in the next room, was simple and impossible. Why Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Marcus stood outside Harrington Tower at 6:45, watching his reflection waver in the glass facade. The new badge felt heavy in his pocket, a small piece of plastic that somehow represented the distance between who he'd been last week and who he was supposed to become today. He dropped Ivy at before-school care early, endured her questions about why he looked so nervous, promised her they'd celebrate his new position with pizza Friday night. She'd hugged him extra tight before running to join her friends, and the warmth of that small body against his chest was the only thing keeping him from turning around and walking away. The executive floor at 7 in the morning was a different world than the silent space he'd encountered during the emergency call. Now it hummed with controlled energy assistants arranging schedules. Junior executives clutching coffee like lifelines, the soft ping of elevator arrivals delivering the day's first wave of ambition and anxiety. Marcus felt immediately out of place, a maintenance worker in navy blue, surrounded by tailored suits and clicking heels. The reception desk curved along one wall like a spaceship console, all blonde wood and embedded screens. The woman behind it looked up as he approached her, a smile professional, but not unkind. His voice came out rougher than intended. Marcus Stone, I'm supposed to report here for executive support services. Recognition flashed across her face. Yes, we've been expecting you. I'm Jennifer. You'll be working primarily with me for coordination, Miss Tuss. Harrington's executive assistant, Diana Foster, will brief you on protocols in a moment. She's just finishing with the morning briefing. Jennifer gestured toward the seating area that looked like it belonged in an art gallery, low-slung chairs and leather, so soft it probably cost more than his monthly rent. Marcus perched on the edge of a chair, his tool bag resting between his boots, feeling like an imposter in expensive clothing. Around him, the executive floor continued its choreographed dance, people moving with purpose, their conversations happening in low tones that suggested everything discussed was confidential and crucial. This was the machinery of power, and he was about to become a very small cog in something vast and incomprehensible. A voice cut through his anxieties, sharp and businesslike. Mr. Stone! Marcus stood quickly, nearly knocking over his tool bag. The woman who'd spoken was in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed in charcoal gray, with sharp eyes that assessed him in a single glance, and seemed to catalog every detail, every weakness, every way he might fail. This was Diana Foster, and she moved like someone who'd learned to navigate these hallways in her sleep, every step calculated and efficient. Her instruction came clipped and professional. Follow me, please. Diana led Marcus through corridors that made the reception area look modest, past offices where people spoke in hushed tones about quarterly projections and market shares, their words floating out through open doors like incantations in a language he barely understood. The small office, she showed him, occupied a space near the electrical panel he'd fixed that first morning, tucked discreetly where someone could work without being noticed. Compared to the basement break room where he usually left his things, this was palatial. A desk with an actual ergonomic chair, built-in cabinets for equipment, and a window that showed the city below, like a promise he hadn't dared to believe in. The view stretched across downtown Seattle buildings, catching morning light ferries crossing Elliott Bay like toys in a bathtub. Diana's briefing came rapid and thorough. You'll maintain all systems on this floor with priority given to Ms. Harrington's immediate area. Response time for her requests is 10 minutes maximum. All other issues should be resolved within the hour unless they require parts or outside contractors. She handed him a tablet that felt expensive and foreign in his calloused hands. This links to the building management system. You'll receive all work orders here along with Ms. Harrington's schedule so you can plan maintenance around her meetings and commitments. That schedule is confidential. You don't discuss it with anyone, including other maintenance staff. Marcus's response came automatic. Understood. Diana's eyes held his, measuring something he couldn't quite identify. Ms. Harrington values three things above all else: discretion, efficiency, and invisibility. Your work should be seamless. She shouldn't have to think about whether the lights work or the temperature is comfortable. If she notices you at all, it should be because you've solved a problem before it became her problem. The irony of being told to be invisible by the woman whose boss had personally promoted him wasn't lost on Marcus. He kept his expression neutral and nodded, absorbing information that felt like instructions for defusing bombs. Diana continued laying out protocols that governed everything from when he could enter offices for maintenance to how he should respond if executives asked him questions about other executives. The answer to that last one was simple: "I'm sorry, I can't discuss other staff members." Always polite, always professional, always a wall. Her final words carried particular weight. "Ms. Harrington doesn't make recommendations lightly, Mr. Stone. She saw something in you that made her believe you belong up here. I suggest you prove her right." Before Marcus could respond, Diana was gone, her departure as efficient as everything else about her. He stood alone in his new office, surrounded by the trappings of a life he'd never imagined, and wondered what exactly Elena Harrington had seen in him that justified this leap of faith. The first week passed in a blur of learning protocols and staying invisible. Marcus memorized the building management system, familiarized himself with every circuit breaker, and HVAC control discovered that the executive floor had more technology packed into a single level than the rest of the building combined. Smart glass that adjusted for light levels, climate controls that responded to occupancy sensors, conference room systems that cost more than luxury cars. Everything was designed to appear effortless while requiring constant maintenance to maintain the illusion of perfection. Through it all, he caught only glimpses of Elena, a flash of mahogany hair, as she strode past, her voice carrying through a conference room door with that crisp authority he remembered from their first encounter. Once he was replacing a malfunctioning light fixture in the hallway when she emerged from a meeting, and their eyes met for half a second before she looked away and continued walking. She gave no sign of recognition, no acknowledgement that he existed beyond his function as the person who kept her world running smoothly. It should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like standing in a room where all the air had been sucked out, leaving him gasping for something he couldn't name. Marcus told himself it was better this way. Professional, clean, a clear boundary between the man who fixed things and the woman who commanded empires. He was here to do a job, collect a paycheck that was transforming Ivy's life, and maintain the discretion Elena valued so highly. That moment in her office when he'd seen vulnerability crack through her armor was an aberration, a mistake they were both pretending had never happened. But late at night, lying awake in his apartment that suddenly felt less cramped thanks to the breathing room in his budget, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about the question that had haunted him since he signed the transfer papers. Not why she'd promoted him, he'd pieced that together from the timeline and the file access logs. She'd been watching him work, evaluating his competence, considering him for this position before the incident ever happened. The frosted door had been a test of character, and somehow he'd passed. What he couldn't figure out was the exhaustion he'd seen in her eyes when she'd said those four quiet words. "I know you are," like she'd recognized something in his desperation that resonated with her own hidden truths, some kinship between a maintenance worker, drowning in single parenthood, and a CEO drowning in expectations she couldn't escape. The answer came on his eighth day, in a moment that redefined everything he thought he understood. It was late afternoon, almost 6, and the executive floor was emptying as people departed for dinner meetings or headed home to families and lives that existed beyond these walls. Marcus was in the main auditorium testing a video system that had glitched during a presentation that morning. The technology was sophisticated enough that the manual read like a foreign language, but he'd spent 2 hours breaking down each component until he found the faulty processor. He was on his back under the stage rewiring connections when he heard voices approaching through the auditorium, Elena's voice cutting through the air like a blade sharp with barely contained fury. The words carried a weight that made him freeze in place, recognizing this was a conversation he absolutely should not be overhearing. Her tone left no room for argument. "I don't care what the legal team says. We're not settling." Derek knew exactly what he was doing when he violated that non-compete. A male voice, older and trying for reason. "Elena, the optics alone." She cut him off with surgical precision. "The optics of backing down are worse. We set a precedent here. Every executive we've ever signed walks away thinking they can steal our clients and we'll just negotiate a settlement." Footsteps approached, heels clicking on the auditorium floor. Marcus remained absolutely still under the stage, barely breathing. The footsteps entered the space above him, and he could see expensive shoes through the gap, Elena's black heels, and a man's polished Oxfords. The door closed with a soft click that felt ominous in the confined space. The man's voice carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. "You're being unreasonably aggressive about this. Derek was your father's hire. Going after him publicly damages Harrison's legacy." Elena's response came cold and measured. "My father's legacy is secured by the company's success, not by protecting executives who betray us. Or are you suggesting I should prioritize sentiment over strategy?" Richard. Marcus's mind supplied the rest. Richard Chamberlain, one of the senior board members. He'd seen the man in briefings, silver hair, an expensive suit, projecting authority that expected deference. The tension in the air above Marcus felt thick enough to cut. Richard's words came weighted with implications. "I'm suggesting you remember that some of us have been with this company since before you were born. Your father trusted Derek. Perhaps you should consider whether your judgment—" Elena interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "My judgment has increased this company's value by 42% in 2 years. My judgment acquired Techline and Meridian when everyone said we were overextending. My judgment—" She stopped abruptly, and Marcus's heart stopped with her. The silence stretched taut and dangerous. Her next words came quiet but deadly. "Is someone in here?" Marcus heard Richard's dismissive tone before he could decide whether to reveal himself. "The maintenance technician. Perhaps you should have him escorted out before we continue discussing confidential matters." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 beats of Marcus's racing heart. Then Elena's voice, not a question, but a statement of fact. "Stone." She knew he was there. Marcus slid out from under the stage tool bag in hand, his face burning with embarrassment. And something else, the sick realization that he'd just overheard a conversation he had no business hearing, words that could be twisted into ammunition if he ever repeated them. Richard Chamberlain stood near the stage steps, his expression making it clear exactly how much he thought of maintenance staff in general, and Marcus specifically. The disdain dripped from every line of his face, the way his eyes barely flickered over Marcus before dismissing him as irrelevant. Marcus's apology came immediate and genuine. "I'm sorry, I was fixing the video system. I didn't mean to intrude on—" Richard cut through his words like they were meaningless. "Did you hear our conversation?" Marcus met the older man's eyes, recognizing the trap in the question. Lying would be pointless. They knew he'd been under the stage. But admitting he'd listened felt like signing his own termination papers. He chose his words carefully, threading a needle he could barely see. His response came measured and deliberate. "I heard voices. I didn't listen. It wasn't my business." It was a distinction without a difference, and they all knew it. Richard's expression said he expected immediate dismissal, security, called possibly legal action for industrial espionage, or whatever corporate lawyers could dream up to crush someone who'd accidentally been in the wrong place. But Elena just studied Marcus with that same unreadable intensity he'd seen in her office, weighing him on scales only she could see. The moment stretched until Marcus thought he might snap under the pressure. Then Elena's voice came quiet but absolute. "Finish your work, then leave." Marcus turned back to the video system with hands that wanted to shake, hyper-aware of the conversation continuing in low tones behind him. He worked as quickly as possible without compromising the repair testing connections, verifying the fix, every second feeling like an eternity. When he finally packed up his tools and headed for the door, Richard was mid-sentence about shareholder concerns. Neither of them acknowledged Marcus's departure, as if he'd already ceased to exist. He made it to his small office and leaned against the closed door, his pulse hammering in his ears. The smart thing would be to go home, forget what he'd heard, never mention it to anyone. Discretion, that's what Elena valued above all else. She'd chosen him specifically because she believed he understood how to keep his mouth shut about things he saw and heard in the machinery of power. But the look in her eyes when she'd realized he was there hadn't been anger. It had been calculation, like she was testing him again, measuring him against some standard he didn't understand. Around 8 of that evening, when the executive floor was dark and silent, except for the glow of emergency lighting, his tablet pinged with a message. The sender made his breath catch, Elena's private email, sent directly to his work account. The message contained exactly 7 words, no greeting or signature, just a simple acknowledgement that carried more weight than any lengthy explanation could have managed. The words glowed on his screen. Your discretion is noted and appreciated. VB. Marcus stared at them until his eyes blurred, trying to decode the meaning underneath. She'd been testing him deliberately, or had she simply seized an opportunity when it presented itself? Either way, she'd watched him overhear a confidential conversation and choose silence, and she'd acknowledged it. The implications cascaded through his mind like dominoes falling. Elena Harrington was building something around him, constructing a role that went beyond fixing electrical systems and maintaining climate control. She was creating a position of trust, placing him in proximity to power, because she believed he could be counted on to see things, hear things, and keep them locked behind his teeth. The following week, Elena requested him by name for the first time. The work order came through his tablet at 2:37 in the afternoon, marked with a priority flag he'd learned meant drop everything temperature control malfunction in Sohio office. Immediate response required. Marcus grabbed his equipment and made it to Elena's wing in under 8 minutes, mentally running through possible causes as he moved. Catherine intercepted him at the entrance, her expression tight with concern and something that might have been relief at seeing him arrive so quickly. Her words came rushed and professional. She's been in back-to-back video conferences for 3 hours. The AC cut out 40 minutes ago, and the room's getting uncomfortable. Fix it quickly and quietly. The door to Elena's office stood open, and he could hear her voice as he approached, still crisp and controlled, despite what had to be stifling heat. The words carried through the doorway with that same authority she wielded, like a weapon never showing weakness, even when circumstances warranted it. Her tone brooked no argument. I understand your concerns about the timeline. David, what I need you to understand is that the board won't approve additional delays. We launch in 6 weeks regardless of... Marcus slipped into the office, keeping to the perimeter, making himself as invisible as possible while moving with purpose. The temperature was indeed uncomfortable, climbing toward 80 degrees and rising. Elena sat behind her massive desk, facing a wall of screens, showing various video conference participants, her posture perfect despite the heat. She didn't acknowledge his presence with words or gesture, but he saw her shoulders relax fractionally, a tension releasing that told him she'd been aware of his arrival. The thermostat was mounted behind a panel that matched the wall, perfectly designed to disappear into the expensive woodwork. Marcus opened it silently and ran diagnostics on his tablet, the problem revealing itself immediately, a failed sensor sending incorrect readings to the climate control system. He had a replacement in his bag, always carried extras of the most common failure points after learning that lesson the hard way in his first year. Cool air began flowing through the vents within minutes of swapping the sensor, the system responding to his commands like a living thing waking from sleep. Elena's voice shifted, carrying a note of satisfaction. We've been over this. Marketing doesn't drive the launch schedule. Product readiness does. If your team can't deliver the campaign materials by week 4, we'll find someone who can. Marcus allowed himself a glance toward her and found her watching him in the reflection of her darkened screens, her eyes tracking his movements even as she verbally dismantled someone's excuses. The observation sent something electric down his spine, the realization that she'd been aware of him the entire time, monitoring his work while simultaneously managing a conference call worth millions. She saw everything missed, nothing operated on multiple levels simultaneously in a way that was both impressive and slightly terrifying. Her next words carried layers, much better. Now that we can all think clearly again, let's discuss realistic deliverables. The temperature reference wasn't about the conference call. She was talking to him, acknowledging the fix without breaking focus on the meeting, a subtle communication that only he would understand. Marcus finished his work and left as quietly as he'd entered, but the weight of her gaze followed him all the way to the door. 10 minutes later, another message appeared on his tablet, as brief and precise as the first efficient work. Thank you. 3 days after that, she asked for him again, a malfunctioning outlet in her private conference room, discovered 15 minutes before a meeting with potential investors. Marcus replaced the outlet in under 10 minutes, while Elena reviewed presentation materials at the table, her presence a constant weight in his peripheral vision. Then again, a flickering light above her desk that she said was disrupting her focus during late-night work sessions. A coffee maker in her private kitchen that refused to function. A loose door handle that caught on her sleeve. Small things easily fixed, but each request came directly from her bypassing the normal work order system. And each one felt like another layer of something being built between them. Not friendship, exactly. Not trust, but something more complicated that he didn't have words to describe. Marcus began to understand the real reason she'd promoted him. It wasn't just about discretion regarding what had happened in her office that morning. It was about reliability in a world where everyone wanted something from her, where every interaction carried the weight of calculation and agenda. Elena Harrington had built her entire life around control, and she needed someone in her immediate environment who could solve problems efficiently without requiring management or explanation. She needed someone who understood what she needed before she had to ask for it, someone who existed in her space without demanding attention or recognition. He started anticipating issues before they became problems, noticed when the temperature in her wing fluctuated and adjusted it before she felt the change, identified a pattern in the lighting system that caused a brief flicker every third day and replaced the timer module preemptively. He kept spare parts for every system she used regularly stored in his office for immediate access, eliminating the delay of requisitioning supplies. And slowly, incrementally, the Ice Queen began to thaw in his presence. It started with simple acknowledgments, a nod when he arrived to fix something, a quiet thank you when he left. Then actual words beyond professional courtesy, observations that revealed she noticed more than he'd realized. One morning he arrived at 7:15 to replace a smoke detector 30 minutes before her first scheduled meeting, thinking he'd have the space to himself. Elena's voice came from behind him, carrying genuine curiosity rather than criticism. The observation was simple but loaded. "You're here early." Marcus looked up from the smoke detector he was installing to find Elena standing in her office doorway, a tablet in one hand and coffee in the other. The sight of her in this in-between moment, not yet fully armored for the day, her expression softer than the mask she wore in meetings, made something in his chest constrict. She looked human in a way that made him acutely aware of the distance between them, the gulf that separated maintenance technician from CEO, no matter how many times she requested him specifically. His response came reflexive. "Wanted to finish before your first meeting, ma'am. Diana mentioned you have investors at 8:30. Elena had been reviewing something on her tablet, but she looked up at that, her dark eyes finding his with that intensity he'd learned meant she was truly paying attention. "You read the briefings." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway, needing to explain the logic behind what might seem like overstepping. "Helps me plan my work around your schedule so I'm not interrupting important meetings." Something flickered across Elena's face, too quick to identify, but carrying emotional weight. She studied him with those dark eyes that seemed to catalog everything, and Marcus felt suddenly exposed on his ladder, aware of how different they were, her, in a suit that probably cost what he used to make in a month, him in work clothes with tools hanging from his belt. The silence stretched until he thought he should say something to break it, but before he could find words, she spoke again. The question came weighted with genuine curiosity. "Most people on my staff do the minimum required and nothing more. Why don't you, Marcus secured the new smoke detector before answering, giving himself time to choose words carefully. This felt like another test, another moment where the wrong response could shift something fundamental between them. The truth would be easiest, but the truth meant revealing more than he was comfortable with, pulling back layers to show the desperation that drove every choice he made. But Elena had asked directly, and something about the way she watched him suggested she'd know if he tried to deflect. His voice came out rougher than intended, carrying 6 years of exhaustion. "I have a daughter. She deserves better than minimum effort. This job, what you did for me, giving me this position, it changed our lives. Seemed like the least I could do was earn it." The words hung in the air between them, more honest than he'd meant to be, exposing the core truth that governed everything he did. Ivy was why he worked himself to exhaustion, why he anticipated problems before they appeared, why he read briefings and learned schedules and made himself indispensable. Because losing this job meant losing the ability to give his daughter the life she deserved, and that was unacceptable. Elena's expression shifted in response to his admission. Something complicated moving behind her eyes, recognition perhaps, or understanding, or something deeper that he couldn't quite identify. She set down her tablet with deliberate care, her full attention now focused on him in a way that made the air feel charged. Her next question came softer. "Just the two of you." Marcus climbed down from the ladder, needing solid ground for this conversation. Just us. Her mother left before she was born. It's been me and Ivy against the world ever since. The confession hung between them, more vulnerable than he'd intended. But Elena didn't look away, didn't retreat behind professional distance. Instead, she held his gaze and offered her own truth in return, a reciprocal vulnerability that felt like a gift and a burden in equal measure. Her voice carried quiet acknowledgement. That must be difficult. His response came simple and absolute. It's everything. Then because she'd opened the door and he'd already revealed so much, Marcus found himself reversing the question with a boldness that surprised him. The words came out before he could stop them, crossing boundaries he should have respected, but finding himself unable to maintain in the face of her humanity. He stumbled through it. What about you? Is there... He stopped, realizing too late he was crossing a line, but Elena didn't look offended. Instead, she smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips that transformed her face for just a second, revealing the woman behind the armor. The expression carried years of loneliness, of calculated distance, of choosing power over connection. So many times it became habit. Her answer came matter-of-fact, stripped of self-pity. No one. Building an empire doesn't leave much time for personal entanglements. And most people want something from me. Power connections, proximity to success. It becomes difficult to know what's real. The honesty in her voice startled him, this glimpse behind the carefully maintained facade. Marcus understood then that this was trust being offered, a rare moment where Elena Harrington let someone see past the Ice Queen to the person underneath. The recognition settled between them like a living thing, an understanding that neither of them had expected to find here in her office at 7:15 in the morning, while he stood on a ladder replacing a smoke detector. His voice came quiet. I can't imagine what that's like, not trusting people's intentions. Elena's eyes held his, and something passed between them that felt significant. Foundational. Can't you... You trusted your daughter's mother. She left. Now you raise Ivy alone, working yourself to exhaustion to provide for her. I'd imagine trust is complicated for you too. She was right. The recognition landed like a physical blow. The realization that they weren't so different after all. Both of them betrayed both of them alone, both of them building walls to protect themselves from being hurt again. Marcus's throat felt tight, the weight of 6 years of loneliness pressing down on him with sudden force. He'd been so focused on surviving, on giving Ivy everything she needed, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen by another adult, truly seen past the roles and responsibilities to the person underneath. His next words came out raw. I should finish this. Elena didn't move for a long moment, then she nodded once, a gesture that felt like acknowledgement of something unspoken. Yes. But she didn't leave. She stayed there in her doorway working on her tablet while Marcus completed the installation, and her presence felt different now, less like surveillance and more like companionship, two lonely people sharing space without needing to fill it with words. When he climbed down and packed his tools, she looked up one more time, and the weight of her gaze felt almost warm. Her voice carried something new. Thank you, Marcus. The use of his first name rewired something fundamental in his chest, creating a connection he wasn't sure he wanted, but couldn't seem to prevent. The sound of it in her voice, spoken with that precise enunciation, made everything feel different, more real, more dangerous, more impossible to ignore. The day everything changed started ordinarily enough. Marcus arrived at 6:30 for the morning briefing, coffee in hand, prepared for another day of invisible efficiency, maintaining systems few people noticed until they failed. Diana ran through the schedule with her usual precision: video conferences, department reviews, a site visit from a tech journalist, and an all-hands presentation at 4 in the main auditorium. Her emphasis on that last item carried particular weight that made everyone in the briefing room sit up straighter. Diana's tone left no room for interpretation. The presentation is particularly important. Ms. Harrington will announce the new product line, the AI chip integration we've been developing. There will be press, investors, and all senior staff. Everything needs to be perfect. Marcus made notes on his tablet, though the auditorium was technically outside his jurisdiction. He coordinated with the facilities team to ensure all executive floor systems would be stable during the event, eliminating any possibility of distraction or failure that might reflect poorly on Elena. She'd be under intense scrutiny during this announcement, the culmination of 2 years of development and millions in investment, And the last thing she needed was technical failure making her look unprepared. The morning proceeded smoothly. He handled routine maintenance, responded to a minor printer malfunction in the finance director's office, replaced a burned-out LED in one of the conference rooms. The work had become almost meditative, his hands moving through familiar motions, while his mind processed the complexities of existing in proximity to Elena Harrington. Around 2 in the afternoon, Marcus decided to check the auditorium personally just to verify everything the facilities team had reported. The space seated 300 and featured a stage with professional lighting, video screens, and sound systems sophisticated enough for concert venues. The facilities team had done good work. Everything looked pristine, the technology tested and ready. Marcus was about to leave when something made him look up at the lighting rig, that instinct developed over 3 years of maintenance work that could spot things that weren't quite right. Subtle misalignments that suggested potential problems before they became catastrophes. One of the stage lights looked off-center, its mounting bracket slightly twisted in a way that set off alarm bells in his mind. He found a ladder and climbed up to inspect it, his stomach already sinking with the knowledge that something was wrong. What he discovered made his blood run cold, the kind of cold that came from recognizing deliberate malice rather than accidental failure. The safety cable, the backup that prevented lights from falling if the main mount failed, was frayed nearly through. Not from age or wear, but from what looked like deliberate cutting, someone taking a saw or blade to the braided steel until only a few strands remained. And the main mounting bolt was loose, turned back several threads held in place by friction alone, rather than the secure torque it should have had. Marcus's hands shook as he examined the setup with growing horror. This wasn't accident or neglect or poor maintenance. This was sabotage, deliberate and calculated. The light weighed at least 40 pounds. If it fell during the presentation directly onto the stage where Elena would be standing, he didn't let himself finish the thought. His mind raced through implications, through the timeline of what this meant. Someone had accessed this auditorium after hours, climbed into the lighting rig with tools and systematically compromised the safety systems. Someone wanted Elena Harrington dead, and they'd planned it with enough sophistication to make it look like a tragic accident. Working with hands that trembled, despite his best efforts to steady them, Marcus secured the mounting bolt properly, tested the weight distribution to ensure it would hold, and replaced the safety cable entirely with one from his emergency supply kit. Then he checked every other light in the rig, finding 2 more with loosened bolts, though their safety cables remained intact. He secured them all, documenting everything with photos time-stamped and geotagged, creating a record of what he'd found and what he'd fixed. By the time he finished, 90 minutes had passed, and his shirt was soaked with sweat that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the implications of what he'd discovered. The question burning in his mind was whether to report this to tell Deanna or security or someone that this wasn't maintenance failure but deliberate sabotage. If this was intentional and the evidence suggested nothing else, there were protocols for this investigation's potential danger to Elena that extended beyond a rigged light fixture. But he had no proof beyond his professional judgment that the damage was deliberate. The frayed cable could theoretically be explained as where unlikely as that seemed. The loose bolts might be attributed to poor maintenance by someone else, though that didn't explain the pattern across multiple fixtures. And if he was wrong, if he raised alarms that led nowhere, he'd look paranoid or attention-seeking, exactly the kind of problem employee Elena didn't need in her inner circle. Worse, he'd put himself directly in her line of sight in a way that violated everything she valued about him, his ability to solve problems quietly without creating drama or requiring her attention. Marcus made his decision, knowing it might be the wrong one, but unable to see a better path forward. He'd document everything, secure the systems, and make a note to check them again before the presentation. Then he'd monitor during the event, staying close to the lighting controls, ready to cut power if anything looked wrong. If nothing happened, he'd saved Elena from a potential accident without creating unnecessary panic. If something did happen despite his precautions, he'd have evidence that he'd identified and attempted to address the problem. The logic felt sound, even as doubt gnawed at him, whispering that he should be doing more, saying more, protecting her more completely. At 3:30, Diana sent a message asking him to verify the video feeds in the auditorium one final time before the presentation began. Marcus went back down, checked the lights again, still secure, still properly mounted, and confirmed all systems were operational. People were already filling the seats. press photographers setting up cameras along the back wall, investors in expensive suits clustering near the front rows. The energy in the room built like a gathering storm, anticipation and excitement, and the particular tension that came before major announcements. Marcus positioned himself near the lighting controls at the back of the auditorium, his eyes locked on the stage, every nerve ending firing with hypervigilance. Elena arrived at 3:55, flanked by Diana and two senior executives Marcus didn't recognize. She wore a deep blue suit that commanded attention. Her hair pulled back severely, her expression calm and confident in a way that made his chest tighten with something he didn't want to examine too closely. She looked like she owned the world, like nothing could touch her, like she'd been born to stand on stages and announce innovations that would change industries. The contrast between that confident exterior and the vulnerability he'd seen in private moments made something ache in him, a protective instinct he had no right to feel but couldn't seem to suppress. Their eyes met across the distance of the auditorium, Elena's gaze finding his like she'd known exactly where he'd be standing. Something passed between them in that moment, acknowledgement perhaps, or recognition of the role he'd taken on without being asked, the invisible guardian watching from shadows. Then she turned her attention to her notes, and Marcus forced himself to breathe, to focus on the job at hand rather than the way his pulse quickened when she looked at him. The presentation began with the smooth professionalism of an operation that had been rehearsed to perfection. Elena spoke with the kind of authority that made people lean forward, her voice carrying perfectly through the sound system. She outlined the new AI chip line with precision, explaining how the technology would revolutionize edge computing, reduce latency, enable applications that currently existed only in theory. She fielded questions from journalists with sharp intelligence, commanded the stage like she'd been born to it, and Marcus felt something like pride watching her work. He stood near the lighting controls, watching not the presentation, but the equipment, the stage lights held steady, the video screens displayed perfectly, everything working exactly as it should. He started to relax, to think maybe he'd been wrong about the sabotage, maybe the damage had been negligent maintenance after all, and his precautions were overkill. Then 22 minutes into the presentation, the light directly above center stage shifted a slight rotation on its mount, subtle but visible to someone who knew exactly what to look for. Marcus's blood turned to ice. Someone was in the lighting catwalk above the stage right now, actively working to compromise the system he'd secured. He could see movement in the shadows above a figure, adjusting something he couldn't quite make out from this distance. The saboteur was here, watching Elena present, waiting for the perfect moment to trigger the accident that would end her life in front of 300 witnesses. Marcus moved before thinking, racing toward the stage access stairs on the opposite side of the auditorium. But the stairs were too far away, and Elena was directly under that light, still speaking with complete confidence, unaware of the danger gathering above her, like a sword suspended by fraying threads. The light shifted again, rotated further, its bracket groaning with stress that carried across the auditorium to Marcus's trained ears. He had seconds, not minutes, and the stairs were too far, and Elena was going to die unless he did something now. Marcus abandoned stealth and ran, his boots pounding against the auditorium floor, drawing attention from confused security guards and startled attendees. He saw Diana's face turn toward him, confusion and alarm warring in her expression. Saw Elena pause mid-sentence, her eyes finding him, racing toward the stage with what must have looked like madness written across his face. The light above her groaned again, the sound of metal straining against compromised connections, and Marcus's voice tore from his throat in a shout that carried across the suddenly silent auditorium. The command came raw and desperate. "Get away from center stage now!" Elena froze, confusion and authority warring on her face, her CEO training keeping her rooted even as instinct screamed danger. Years of maintaining perfect control in public wouldn't let her bolt from a stage because a maintenance worker was shouting, wouldn't let her show panic in front of investors and press. The hesitation lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was 2 seconds too long. Marcus didn't have time to explain, didn't have time for anything except action. He launched himself onto the stage, taking the steps 3 at a time. His only thought, the distance between himself and Elena, the closing window of opportunity to move her before physics took over and 40 pounds of metal and glass fell from 20 feet up. He grabbed her around the waist and threw them both sideways with every ounce of strength he possessed, twisting his body so his shoulder would hit the stage floor first, so he'd take the impact and Elena would land on him rather than the unforgiving wood. Half a second later, exactly where Elena had been standing, 40 pounds of metal and glass crashed with the sound of a gunshot. The mounting bracket finally gave way completely. Safety cable already severed, nothing to stop gravity from doing its work. The light exploded on impact glass, shattering into thousands of glittering fragments. Sparks flying from severed electrical connections, the smell of burning plastic and ozone filling the air. The crowd erupted in chaos, screaming, people running for exits, security converging from all directions, cameras flashing as photographers captured the moment of disaster. But Marcus only registered Elena in his arms, her body pressed against his, her heart hammering so hard he could feel it through their clothes. Her dark eyes were wide with shock, her perfect composure shattered, and she was shaking, trembling so violently he could feel the vibrations through his own chest. Glass shards glittered across the stage around them, some pieces large enough to have done serious damage if they'd hit flesh. The reality of how close she'd come to death settled over them both like a physical weight. His voice came hoarse and desperate. "Are you hurt? Did the glass hit you?" Elena's response trembled despite her clear attempt at control. "I'm fine. How did you know?" Marcus tried to form words, tried to explain about the sabotage he'd found that afternoon, the figure he'd seen in the catwalk, but his throat wouldn't cooperate. All that came out was fragmented. "I'll explain later. Right now, we need to." Security surrounded them before he could finish pulling them apart with professional efficiency. Voices shouted questions and orders that overlapped into meaningless noise. Wyatt caught a glimpse of figures fleeing from the catwalk access, saw guards racing after them through exits. Diana was there suddenly, her professional mask cracked with genuine terror that made her look 10 years older, helping Elena to her feet with hands that shook. Her voice cut through the chaos with desperate authority. "I'm fine. Everyone calm down. Clear the auditorium in an orderly fashion." Diana gets security too. Diana was already coordinating on her phone, snapping orders that dispersed through the building like ripples from a stone. Elena's eyes found Marcus again, where he still lay on the stage floor, his shoulders screaming, where he'd absorbed their combined impact, blood running from a cut on his arm where a shard had caught him. The look on her face was something he'd never seen before, shock and gratitude, and something deeper that made his breath catch in his throat despite the adrenaline still flooding his system. Her voice came raw. "You're bleeding." Marcus looked down at his arm, surprised to see red spreading across his sleeve. "It's nothing." Diana interrupted, her professional demeanor reasserting itself through visible effort. "We need to get you to a secure location until security sweeps the building. Please, Elena." For a moment, Marcus thought Elena would refuse, would insist on staying to manage the crisis personally despite the danger. But she let Diana guide her toward the exit, looking back at him one last time, with an expression that carried too many layers to parse. Gratitude, certainly, but also fear and recognition, and something that looked almost like wonder. Then she was gone, and Marcus was surrounded by security personnel, asking questions. He barely heard his mind replaying those seconds on a loop, the weight of Elena in his arms, the terror in her eyes, the absolute certainty that if he'd been 1 second slower, she would have died. The security office on the second floor became command central within minutes of the auditorium evacuation. Marcus sat in a hard plastic chair while a paramedic cleaned the gash on his forearm, the sting of antiseptic barely registering against the adrenaline still flooding his system. Around him, guards spoke in clipped tones into radios, coordinating a building-wide lockdown while reviewing security footage on a wall of monitors. His body felt like it was vibrating at a frequency just below visible, every nerve ending firing with the aftershocks of what had almost happened. The paramedic's voice came distant. "You're lucky. Another inch and this would have needed stitches." Lucky wasn't the word Marcus would have chosen. He felt like his entire body was a live wire crackling with the memory of Elena's weight in his arms, the sound of glass exploding, the split-second calculation that had saved her life. James Webb pulled up a chair, his expression grave in a way that suggested he'd seen too many crimes to be shocked anymore. But this one had gotten through his defenses. The head of security moved with the economy of someone who'd learned that wasted motion meant wasted time, and right now time was the only currency that mattered. His voice carried professional calm over deep concern. "Walk me through what happened. Start with why you were checking the auditorium in the first place." Marcus explained about the morning briefing, his decision to personally verify the systems, finding the frayed safety cable and loose mounting bolts. He showed Webb the photos on his tablet, timestamped from hours before the presentation, the evidence laid out in clinical detail that couldn't be argued with. Webb's jaw tightened as he studied the images, his experienced eye recognizing immediately what Marcus had recognized. This was no accident, no negligent maintenance, but deliberate sabotage executed with enough sophistication to appear otherwise. Webb's next question came sharp. You fixed it, secured everything properly. So how did the light still fall? The answer made Marcus's stomach clench with the implications. Someone was up in the catwalk during the presentation. I saw movement, saw them working on something. They must have loosened it again or found another way to compromise the mount. Webb turned to the monitors, pulling up footage that showed a figure in dark coveralls accessing the catwalk 20 minutes into the presentation. The image quality was good enough to see the person carried tools move with purpose, but the face remained hidden beneath a hood and careful positioning that suggested they knew exactly where the cameras were. Whoever had done this understood the building's security systems, had planned their approach to minimize exposure, and had the technical knowledge to sabotage professional lighting rigs. This wasn't opportunistic, it was calculated, professional, dangerous, in ways that extended far beyond a single failed attempt. Webb's voice hardened with each word. Did you see a face? Any identifying features? Marcus shook his head, frustration and fear warring in his chest. No, just a silhouette, dark clothes moving fast, and you didn't report the initial sabotage. The statement carried weight, but not quite accusation. Marcus met Webb's eyes, knowing this conversation could end very differently, depending on how he explained his reasoning, how he justified keeping silent about a threat to Elena's life. His words came careful but honest. I considered it, but I had no proof it was deliberate. Could have been negligent at maintenance. I documented everything, fixed the immediate danger, and planned to monitor it. I didn't expect someone to actively interfere during the event itself. Webb studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Your quick thinking saved Ms. Harrington's life. That's clear. But this situation is now a criminal investigation, attempted murder, possibly corporate espionage. You'll need to make a formal statement. The word murder landed like a physical blow, making everything suddenly more real. Someone wanted Elena dead badly enough to plan this elaborate scheme, to climb into rigging during a public event, to risk everything on the chance that a falling light would look accidental. The implications spread through Marcus's mind like cracks in ice. This wasn't over. Whoever had done this would try again, and Elena was walking around with a target on her back that she might not even fully comprehend yet. His response came automatic, whatever you need. The door opened and Diana appeared, her usual composure restored, but strain visible around her eyes like fine cracks in porcelain. Mr. Stone, Miss Harrington wants to see you now. Webb nodded permission and Marcus followed Diana through corridors now patrolled by additional security, past employees gathered in worried clusters, speaking in hushed tones about what they'd witnessed. The executive floor felt different than it had this morning. The same physical space transformed by violence into something uncertain and dangerous. Diana led him not to Elena's office, but to a smaller conference room he'd never entered before, a private space where difficult conversations happened, away from witnesses and recording systems. Elena stood at the window with her back to the door, still in the blue suit, but with her hair down now, falling in waves across her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable than the armor of CEO perfection usually allowed. She didn't turn when they entered, and Diana hesitated at the threshold, as if unsure whether to follow protocol or instinct. Elena's voice came soft but absolute. Leave us. Diana's professional concern warred with trained obedience. Elena's security protocols suggest. The interruption came gentle but final. I'm safe with Marcus. The words carried layers Marcus didn't have time to unpack. Diana left, closing the door with a click that seemed too loud in the silence. Marcus stood just inside the room, unsure whether to speak or wait, his heart hammering against his ribs with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the woman in front of him. Elena still hadn't turned, her shoulders rigid with tension that spoke of control barely maintained, and Marcus recognized the signs of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. Her next words came out raw. You tackled me. The observation carried disbelief and something deeper, as if she was still processing what had happened, still trying to reconcile the reality of being physically grabbed and thrown to safety by someone who shouldn't have dared to touch her. In front of 300 people, you grabbed me and threw us both to the ground. Marcus's throat felt tight. I'm sorry. I didn't have time to. She turned, then cutting him off, and the expression on her face stopped his words. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her carefully maintained mask completely gone, revealing something raw and undefended that made his chest constrict. This wasn't the Ice Queen, or the CEO, or any of the personas she wore like armor. This was Elena Harrington confronting her own mortality stripped of every defense, and the vulnerability in her face was almost painful to witness. Her voice shook despite clear effort at control. Don't apologize. Do you understand what you did? If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't seen that light shifting, I would be dead right now. The rawness in her voice hit Marcus like a physical blow, carrying the weight of realization that she'd come within seconds of dying in front of hundreds of people. He wanted to say something comforting, wanted to minimize the danger to make it less terrifying, but the truth stood between them, stark and undeniable. She had nearly died, and only his intervention had prevented it. His response came inadequate. I saw the sabotage this afternoon, the frayed cable, the loose bolts. I fixed it, but I should have reported it immediately. Should have insisted they cancel the presentation until Elena crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping close enough that he could see she was still trembling, her body betraying the shock her mind was trying to process. You did exactly what you should have done. You identified a threat, neutralized it, and stayed vigilant. When the danger evolved, you acted without hesitation. Her eyes searched his face with an intensity that made breathing difficult. That's not something to apologize for. She stopped seeming to struggle with words, and Marcus filled the silence with the only truth he could offer. The confession came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. I'm just a maintenance tech. I fix broken things. I'm not. She interrupted with fierce certainty. You're the man who saved my life. Don't tell me what you are or aren't, Marcus Stone. I know exactly what you are. The way she said his full name rewired something fundamental in his chest, creating connections that felt dangerous and inevitable in equal measure. Marcus found himself taking a step closer, drawn by gravity he didn't understand but couldn't resist. The space between them felt charged with electricity that had nothing to do with the building systems and everything to do with the woman in front of him, stripped of pretense, offering trust he wasn't sure he deserved. His voice came rough. What happened up there on the stage that wasn't about maintaining your image or protecting the company? That was about you. Just you. And I would do it again without thinking twice. Elena's breath caught, and for a moment Marcus thought she might say something that would change everything between them. Words that would make this real and permanent and impossible to walk back from. But then her phone buzzed, shattering the moment, and she looked away with visible effort. The professional mask slid back into place, not completely, but enough to function enough to continue existing in a world that demanded she be something other than vulnerable. Her voice steadied with visible effort. Security found evidence in the catwalk. Tools cut cables. They're reviewing all footage from the building. Whoever did this will be caught. Marcus heard what she didn't say, the question of why someone would target her like this, who had the resources and motivation to plan something this elaborate. The silence that followed carried that unspoken weight, the knowledge that this attack suggested enemies powerful enough to threaten everything she'd built. He spoke the thought that had been forming since he first saw the frayed cable. Do you know why someone would want you dead badly enough to plan something like this? Elena's smile turned bitter, a flash of cynicism that didn't quite hide the fear underneath. I'm a young woman running a multi-billion-dollar company in an industry dominated by men who think they deserve what I have. I've made enemies, acquiring competitors, refusing partnerships, choosing merit over politics. The list of people who'd benefit from my death is longer than I'd like to admit. The casual way she said it, people who'd benefit from my death, made Marcus's hands curl into fists at his sides, protective instinct surging through him with startling intensity. That's not normal. That's not acceptable. Her gaze softened slightly. It's reality, and now I have to decide how to handle it. Cancel the product launch, increase security, show weakness to everyone watching for me to fail. His response came immediate and certain. You show strength by staying alive. Everything else is secondary. Elena looked at him with something that might have been wonder, her expression suggesting she was seeing him differently, recalibrating her understanding of who he was and what he meant. You really believe that? The statement wasn't a question, but Marcus answered anyway. I know what it's like to have someone depending on you, to know that your choices, your survival determines their entire world. He thought of Ivy probably finishing her homework right now at Eleanor's apartment, unaware of how close she'd come to losing him today, how close their lives had come to complete destruction. You have thousands of employees whose livelihoods depend on this company. You owe it to them to protect yourself. Elena's eyes held his, searching for something. Is that the only reason the employees? The question hung between them, heavy with implications Marcus wasn't ready to examine. Before he could formulate an answer that wouldn't change everything, the door opened and Webb appeared with two other security personnel, his expression grim in a way that suggested developments that wouldn't be welcome. His words came clipped. He said, Ms. Harrington, we have a situation. We've identified the individual in the catwalk footage. Elena's spine straightened, authority flooding back into her posture. Show me. They moved to a larger conference room where security had set up a command center monitors displaying frozen footage of a man in dark maintenance coveralls accessing the catwalk. The image quality was good enough to see his face clearly mid-40s, sharp features, the kind of face that blended into corporate environments without raising questions. Marcus didn't recognize him, but something about the methodical way the figure moved through the security footage suggested professional training, someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Webb's announcement landed like a bomb. His name is Victor Kane. He's been with building maintenance for 8 months. Background check was clean, references verified. We just discovered his employment application used a false social security number. Elena's voice went cold. Someone planted him. Webb nodded grimly. That's our assessment. We're searching his locker and contacting authorities now. But there's more. He pulled up another image, an email screenshot that made Marcus's stomach drop. This was sent to 3 business journalists 40 minutes ago before the incident. It claims you've been cooking the books, inflating revenue numbers to boost stock prices. The timing suggests whoever sent it expected you to be in no position to defend yourself. The full picture assembled itself in Marcus's mind with sickening clarity. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was coordinated destruction calculated to eliminate Elena and destroy the company simultaneously. Kill the CEO, release damaging accusations, tank the company's value, create chaos that would force a sale or dissolution. Someone had planned this with precision that spoke to resources and inside knowledge that went far beyond a single hired saboteur. Elena's jaw tightened, fury barely contained beneath her controlled exterior. The allegations are false. Our books are audited quarterly by independent firms. But proving that will take time, and the accusation alone will damage investor confidence. Webb's response came strategic. Not if you're standing in front of cameras tomorrow, very much alive, with security footage showing an attempted murder that coincides with fraudulent allegations. That's not whistleblowing. That's conspiracy. Marcus watched Elena process this, saw her mind working through options and consequences with the speed that had made her successful. But beneath the strategic thinking, he could see the strain, the exhaustion, the weight of being targeted by people who wanted not just to defeat her, but to destroy everything she represented. The meeting continued for another hour, Webb coordinating with FBI agents who'd been called in because attempted murder of a CEO counted as federal jurisdiction. Detective Kate Morrison arrived with 2 other agents, a woman in her late 30s with the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen too many crimes to be shocked, but this one had earned her complete attention. She interviewed Marcus separately, taking his statement about the sabotage he'd found and the figure he'd seen in the catwalk, building a case that would connect Victor Kane to the broader conspiracy. Around midnight, Marcus finally made it home to find Eleanor waiting with Ivy already asleep. The old woman's eyes went to the bandage on his arm, the strain in his face, but she asked no questions beyond whether he was all right. He assured her he was paid her the usual amount despite her protests, and stood in Ivy's doorway watching his daughter sleep with the stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. The distance between this peaceful scene and what had almost happened felt unbridgeable, 2 realities separated by split-second decisions and chance positioning. If he'd been 1 second slower, if Elena had been 1 step to the left, if the saboteur had succeeded, the cascade of consequences made his chest tight with retroactive fear. His phone buzzed with a message from Elena's private number. "Thank you for today, for everything. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be complicated." Marcus stared at those words until his vision blurred, trying to decode the meaning underneath. She had his personal number, had reached out after hours, had thanked him like a person rather than an employee. The intimacy of it terrified and thrilled him in equal measure, a boundary crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. 24 hours later, news broke that Victor Kane had been apprehended trying to board a flight to Mexico City. His apartment had yielded a burner phone with messages coordinating the attack, $50,000 in cash, and tools that matched the marks on the cut cables. He was in custody, not talking initially, but law enforcement was confident they could trace the money back to whoever had hired him. Marcus arrived at the executive floor to find it buzzing with controlled urgency, everyone moving with the heightened awareness that came after violence had touched their world. Diana intercepted him immediately, her expression more complex than usual, professional courtesy layered over something that might have been concern or warning. "Ms. Harrington is in her office. She asked for you directly." The phrasing carried implications that made Marcus's pulse quicken. Diana's eyes searched his face like she was looking for something specific, some indication of what was happening between him and Elena that went beyond professional boundaries. Her next words came quieter, meant only for him. She spoke with careful precision. "Whatever's happening between you two, be careful. She's under enormous pressure right now, and she makes decisions based on control and strategy. Don't mistake proximity for something it isn't." The warning was clear and probably wise advice from someone who'd watched Elena navigate the treacherous waters of power for years. Marcus nodded his understanding, but his mind was already focused on what waited behind Elena's closed door, the conversation they needed to have about what came next. He knocked and entered at her invitation, finding her behind her desk, looking like she hadn't slept, circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. But her gaze, when it found him, was warm in a way that made Diana's warning feel insufficient. Elena's first question bypassed pleasantries. "How's your arm?" The concern in her voice felt genuine, stripping away the professional distance that usually governed their interactions. "Fine, barely feel it." That was a lie. It hurt like hell, but he didn't want her worrying about injuries he'd sustained saving her life. Elena stood and moved around her desk, and Marcus noticed how exhausted she looked, the weight of the past 24 hours etched in the tension around her mouth, the way she held her shoulders too rigidly. Her admission came quiet. "I didn't sleep. I spent the night reviewing everyone who might have orchestrated this business. Rivals disgruntled, former employees, board members who opposed my leadership. The list is extensive and depressing." Marcus's response came gentle. "Webb will find the connection. The money trail always leads somewhere." Elena's expression shifted to something more vulnerable. "That's not what worries me. What worries me is that I've built my entire life around not needing anyone. Control, independence, self-reliance. And yesterday I needed you. Absolutely, completely needed you to save my life. That's not a position I'm comfortable occupying." The honesty stunned him, this glimpse into the psychology that drove her relentless pursuit of control. Marcus chose his next words carefully, understanding that how he responded would shape what came next between them, whether they retreated behind professional boundaries or acknowledged what was building in the space they occupied. His voice came steady. "Needing someone in a crisis doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." Elena's eyes held his, searching for something. "I'm not sure I'm allowed to be human. Not in this position. Weakness is blood in the water. Every competitor, every skeptical board member, every journalist looking for a story, they're all waiting for me to prove I don't belong here." The words revealed the impossible standard she held herself to, the exhausting performance of perfection that left no room for vulnerability or need. Marcus understood then that Elena Harrington was drowning, just like he'd been drowning for 6 years, just in a different ocean with different weights pulling her under. His response came from hard-won experience. "So prove them wrong. Show up today stronger than yesterday. Face the cameras, address the allegations, demonstrate that whoever tried to kill you failed spectacularly. That's not weakness. That's power." Something flickered across Elena's face, gratitude maybe, or recognition that he understood what she needed to hear. "You make it sound simple." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't say it was simple. I said it was necessary." He took a breath, knowing he was about to cross another line but unable to stop himself. You asked me yesterday what you are to me. You want the truth. Elena's breath caught, and Marcus saw fear flash across her face, not of physical danger, but of emotional exposure, of hearing something that would require acknowledgement and response. But she nodded, giving him permission to continue, and Marcus felt like he was stepping off a cliff with no idea what waited below. The words came raw and honest. You're the person who changed my daughter's life by giving me a chance I didn't deserve. You're the woman who works 18-hour days to protect thousands of employees she'll never meet. And you're someone who shouldn't have to face death threats and character assassination alone. The silence that followed felt alive, charged with everything they weren't saying. Elena's eyes searched his face like she was looking for proof. He meant it, that this wasn't performance or manipulation designed to extract something from her more. What she found must have satisfied her, because her expression softened into something that looked almost like hope. Her voice came barely above a whisper. I don't know how to do this. How to let someone be close without wondering what they want from me. Marcus's response was simple and absolute. I don't want anything except for you to be safe. That's it. That's all of it. Lena's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall, and Marcus saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. That might be the most valuable thing anyone's ever offered me. Before either of them could say more, before the moment could evolve into something neither was ready for, Marcus's tablet buzzed with an urgent message from Webb. FBI had made a breakthrough in the case, were requesting immediate meeting with Elena. The spell broke, and they stepped back from whatever precipice they'd been standing on, returning to their roles as CEO and technician, as protected and protector as anything other than two people recognizing something profound in each other. 3 days later, FBI Detective Morrison called an emergency meeting in the large conference room. Elena sat at the head of the table with Marcus standing by the door in his role as part of her security detail, a position that had evolved organically from the attempt on her life. Morrison laid out the evidence methodically. Victor Kane had finally broken under interrogation, the combination of federal murder charges and the prospect of life in prison loosening his tongue. What he revealed sent shockwaves through the room. Morrison's words came clinical, but devastating. Kane was hired through an encrypted messaging service. Payment came through 3 layers Bitcoin to an offshore account in the Caymans, then liquidated stock options. Those options belonged to Nathan Cross, your CTO. The name landed like a grenade. Elena went pale, her composure cracking for just a moment before she reassembled it through visible effort. Marcus had heard the name in passing. Nathan Cross, 42 company veteran of 10 years, genius programmer, responsible for much of the AI chip technology they just announced. The man had seemed loyal, dedicated above suspicion. But Morrison's evidence was damning: phone records, financial transactions, messages that laid out the entire conspiracy with brutal clarity. Morrison continued, Mr. Cross has significant gambling debts, $180,000 accumulated at various casinos. 8 months ago, he was approached by representatives claiming to work for Tech Venture Asia, offered a deal. Eliminate you. Nathan becomes interim CEO, immediately agrees to sell company to Tech Venture. Nathan keeps his position in the merged entity, debt cleared, $2 million bonus. Elena's voice came hollow. Nathan came to my father's funeral, told me he believed in my vision for the company, has sat in meetings with me there almost daily for 2 years. And all that time he was planning to kill me. Morrison's expression softened fractionally. We've been watching him since we identified the connection an hour ago. He's in his office right now acting like everything is normal. We need your authorization to arrest him. Marcus waited for Elena to give the order, but instead she shook her head, and he recognized the strategic mind at work even through shock. Not yet, Morrison frowned. Ms. Harrington, he hired a hitman to murder you. Elena's response came sharp with calculation. He doesn't suspect we've connected him. If we arrest now, we lose the chance to find who hired Nathan. I want everyone involved, not just the trigger man. Webb objected from his position near the monitors. Too dangerous. Nathan knows we're investigating. If he suspects we're closing in, Elena cut him off. He doesn't know we cracked the encryption. Feed him false information. Investigation stalled. Trail went cold at the offshore account. Make him think he's safe. He'll contact his handlers. Then we get them all. Morrison studied Elena with new respect. That's risky. Every day Nathan walks free is another day he could run or try again. Elena's voice carried steel. Not if he thinks he's still hidden. Monitor him 24/7. Track every communication, every movement. 48 hours. Either he leads us to the conspiracy or we arrest him on current evidence. Morrison looked to Webb, who nodded reluctantly. The operation was set, surveillance teams deployed, communication monitoring activated, Elena continuing to act normal while they waited for Nathan to make contact with whoever had orchestrated this. The next 2 days were the longest of Marcus's life, staying within 10 feet of Elena, at all times shadowing her through meetings and video conferences, standing outside her office when she needed privacy. Nathan appeared at staff meetings looking concerned and supportive, asking Elena how she was handling the stress after the attempt, offering to take on additional responsibilities. Marcus watched him perform empathy while knowing what the man had tried to do, and every word felt like acid burning through his restraint. On the evening of the second day, around 11 p.m., security alerts went off across the system. Nathan had entered the building through the parking garage. Marcus was with Elena in her office, where she'd been working late as usual, and Webb's voice came urgent through his earpiece, words that made his blood run cold. The message was terse. Nathan just accessed the building. He's not supposed to be here. Heading for executive floor. Marcus's response was immediate. We need to go now. Elena looked up from her work, reading the tension in his voice. What's happening? Before Marcus could answer, the lights went out, complete darkness, swallowing the executive floor as Nathan cut main power to the building. Emergency lights failed to activate, disabled earlier in preparation for this moment. Marcus pulled Elena away from her desk, where she'd be silhouetted against the windows, his eyes adjusting to darkness as city lights provided the only illumination. Footsteps approached through the hallway outside, slow and deliberate, and Marcus recognized the sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Nathan's voice came eerily friendly through the darkness. Elena, are you still here? Power outage. I came to check on you. Marcus saw the lie for what it was. Nathan had come to finish what Victor Kane had failed to do, eliminate the obstacle to his planned fortune. Elena started to respond, to play along, but Marcus saw the silhouette in the doorway and the unmistakable shape of a gun in Nathan's hand, backlit by emergency exit signs in the hallway. Every instinct screamed danger, and Marcus moved without conscious thought, stepping between Elena and the man who'd come to kill her. His voice came hard. The power isn't coming back, Nathan. Nathan's silhouette shifted, the gun rising to point directly at where they stood. Stone, of course you're here. The maintenance hero who's been ruining everything. The bitterness in Nathan's voice revealed depths of resentment Marcus hadn't anticipated. Nathan stepped further into the office, and Marcus could make out his face now in the dim light. Desperation and rage, warring with calculation. A man who'd bet everything on a plan that was falling apart. Nathan's words came venomous. You were never supposed to run this company, Elena. Your father knew it. The board knew it. Everyone except you. You're just playing dress-up in a position you inherited through genetics rather than merit. Elena's response came cold. Who hired you, Nathan? Tech venture. Who's behind this? Nathan laughed, the sound carrying an edge of hysteria. People who understand that innovation shouldn't be controlled by legacy and nepotism. People who offered me a real future where competence matters more than last names. All I had to do was remove the obstacle. The gun steadied, pointing directly at Elena's center mass, and Marcus saw Nathan's finger begin to tighten on the trigger. Time slowed to crystalline clarity, every detail hyper-real. The way light caught the gun's barrel, the set of Nathan's jaw, the distance between Marcus and the weapon. No time to think, only to act, and Marcus's body moved before his mind could calculate the cost. He lunged, throwing himself at Nathan with every ounce of force he possessed, aiming to disrupt the shot even if he couldn't prevent it entirely. The gun discharged, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, muzzle flash, lighting the office like lightning. Marcus felt the bullet pass so close to his head that the air pressure made his ear ring, felt it tug at his hair. But his momentum carried him into Nathan, and they crashed into the wall together. They went down hard, Marcus's shoulder hitting the floor with bruising force, but he was already moving, reaching for the gun, trying to control the weapon before Nathan could fire again. Nathan was stronger than expected, fueled by desperation and rage, fighting with the abandon of someone who had nothing left to lose. They crashed into furniture, struggling in near darkness, and Marcus felt Nathan's elbow drive into his ribs with force that cracked something. The pain was distant, irrelevant, his entire focus on the gun still clutched in Nathan's hand. Marcus saw Elena moving in his peripheral vision, saw her grab something, her desk lamp, heavy brass, and swing it with desperate force into Nathan's head. The CTO staggered, his grip loosening, and Marcus wrenched the gun away, sending it skittering across the floor into darkness, where it couldn't hurt anyone. But Nathan recovered faster than Marcus expected, driven by the fury of someone watching everything they'd planned disintegrate. He tackled Marcus to the ground, hands closing around his throat with methodical pressure, designed to crush rather than merely choke. The pressure built rapidly, Marcus's vision graying at the edges as oxygen became a distant memory. He clawed at Nathan's hands, trying to break the grip, but his strength was fading faster than he could fight. Nathan's voice came from somewhere far away. Should have stayed invisible. Should have just fixed the lights and disappeared. Now you die with her. Marcus's lungs screamed for air that wouldn't come, consciousness slipping away like water through his fingers. Through the gathering darkness, he saw Elena searching frantically for the gun, heard her desperate voice calling for help. Then lights flooded the office, blinding, after so much darkness, and voices shouted from multiple directions. The pressure on Marcus's throat released abruptly as FBI agents and security guards swarmed the room, pulling Nathan away, forcing him to the ground with professional efficiency. Marcus gasped for air, his throat raw and damaged, his lungs burning as oxygen flooded back into his system. Strong hands helped him sit up, and suddenly Elena was there, kneeling beside him, her hands framing his face with desperate gentleness that made something in his chest crack open. Her voice came panicked. "Marcus, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" He tried to speak but only managed to croak, his throat too damaged for words. But he nodded, trying to tell her he was okay, even as his body shook with aftershocks of adrenaline and oxygen deprivation. Elena's eyes were wide with fear he'd never seen there before, tears tracking down her cheeks, and he realized she was shaking as badly as he was. Around them, security was securing Nathan, reading him his rights, coordinating with the FBI agents who'd burst in at exactly the right moment. Marcus caught fragments of Nathan screaming something about, "They'll come for you and you can't stop it," before he was dragged away. Detective Morrison appeared, her expression grim. "We got his confession on audio, plus he mentioned they plural. Nathan wasn't working alone." Webb's response came from somewhere near the monitors. "We need to identify his partners. This conspiracy goes deeper than one disgruntled CTO." But Marcus barely heard them. His entire world narrowed to Elena's face, the terror in her eyes slowly transforming into something else: relief, gratitude, recognition of how close they'd both come to death. Her hands were still on his face, anchoring him to reality, and he found himself leaning into her touch, despite the audience, despite every professional boundary that should have prevented this kind of intimacy. Elena's voice shook. "You impossible, brave, stupid man. You could have died." Marcus managed to rasp out 3 words that hurt his damaged throat. "Couldn't hurt you." 3 days later, Marcus woke in a hospital bed with his shoulder heavily bandaged and his throat feeling like he'd swallowed broken glass. The first thing he saw was Elena's face, tear-stained and exhausted, hovering over him with an expression that made his damaged heart skip. The first thing he tried to say was Ivy's name, terror flooding through him that his daughter didn't know where he was. Elena's hand found his immediately, her grip gentle but anchoring. Her voice came thick with emotion. "She's on her way. Eleanor's bringing her. You're okay. You're going to be okay." The relief was overwhelming enough to make his vision blur. FBI had closed the case within hours of Nathan's arrest. The CTO had broken completely under interrogation, revealing everything. Robert Chamberlain had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, working with Tech Venture Asia to eliminate Elena and force a sale of Harrington Technologies. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, recorded conversations, a paper trail that led directly to Robert's offshore accounts. The older board member was in custody awaiting trial, his reputation destroyed, his conspiracy collapsed. But more remarkably, impossibly, Harrison Harrington had woken from his coma. The doctors couldn't explain it. Brain activity had increased dramatically over the past few days, and that morning he'd opened his eyes for the first time in 2 years. Elena had been at his bedside when it happened, and according to her, his first words had been asking if she was safe. Now Harrison wanted to meet the man who'd saved his daughter's life, and Elena had brought him in a wheelchair despite doctors' protests. The older man looked frail but alert, his eyes sharp with the intelligence that had built an empire. His voice came weak but steady as he studied Marcus with undisguised assessment. "My daughter tells me you saved her life. Twice. And took a bullet meant for her." Marcus's voice came rough from his damaged throat. "Not a bullet, sir. Just Nathan tried to strangle me." Harrison's expression shifted to something that might have been approval. "You threw yourself between my daughter and a man with a gun. That counts." "What's your name, son?" The word son hit Marcus unexpectedly hard, carrying weight he hadn't expected. "Marcus Stone, sir." Harrison nodded slowly, his gaze moving between Marcus and Elena, with the shrewdness of someone who'd built success on reading people accurately. "Marcus, I've been unconscious 2 years. Woke up 3 days ago. Doctors can't explain it. I told them I had to make sure my daughter was safe. Elena told me everything. Robert's betrayal. Nathan's attempt your protection." He paused, gathering strength, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority that had commanded boardrooms for decades. "I built this company on two principles, innovation and integrity. You have both. Single father, hard worker, protect people without asking for reward. That's the kind of man I want standing beside my daughter." The blessing was unmistakable approval from the man whose opinion mattered most to Elena. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion that had nothing to do with the damage Nathan had inflicted. Everything to do with being seen and valued by someone who didn't have to acknowledge his existence. Harrison extended his hand with visible effort, and Marcus shook it carefully, mindful of the older man's frailty. His response came humble. "Thank you, sir." Harrison's next words carried paternal warmth. "Call me Harrison. And Marcus, don't let this one get away. She doesn't trust easily, but when she does, it means something." Elena's face flushed. "Dad." But Harrison just smiled, the expression transforming his face into something almost mischievous. And Marcus saw where Elena had gotten her steel tempered with humanity's strength built on caring rather than domination. 1 month later, Marcus stood in his new apartment, 2 bedrooms, better neighborhood, $4,200 a month, that his new salary as Director of Facilities and Safety Management made manageable, and watched Ivy play with her new toys. The promotion had come with Elena's personal recommendation over his initial protest that people would say he only got it because of their relationship. But Elena had been adamant he'd earned it through competence, through loyalty, through qualities that had nothing to do with who he was to her and everything to do with who he was as a professional. His phone buzzed with a message. "Dinner tonight, actual date, not work dinner. I'll pick you up at 7. Marcus smiled his heart, doing something complicated in his chest. They had been careful since Nathan's arrest, maintaining professional boundaries in public, while acknowledging privately that something profound had shifted between them. Tonight would be their first official date, Elena's idea, her way of saying she was ready to make this real. He typed back confirmation and spent the rest of the day nervous in a way he hadn't been since high school, changing clothes 3 times before settling on dark jeans and a button-down shirt that cost more than he'd ever spent on clothing, but made him feel less outclassed by the woman who'd be picking him up. Elena arrived exactly at 7, driving herself in a Tesla, and the sight of her in a simple black dress rather than a power suit made something in Marcus's chest constrict with want. Dinner at Canlis was everything he'd imagined fine dining to be, and nothing like it. Beautiful food that tasted as good as it looked, Elliott Bay visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, but most importantly, Elena across from him, with her walls down, laughing at his stories about Ivy's latest obsession with becoming a veterinarian, sharing her own fears and hopes in return. Over dessert, she reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture simple but profound. Her voice came vulnerable in a way that still surprised him. "I've never done this, actual dating. It terrifies me." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Me neither. We'll figure it out together." Outside the restaurant afterward, with Seattle's skyline glittering behind them, in Elliott Bay dark and mysterious below, Elena kissed him. Not the tentative brush of lips testing boundaries, but a real kiss that tasted of wine and promise, and everything neither of them had dared to hope for. Paparazzi cameras flashed inevitable, given who she was, but neither of them pulled away. They'd both survived too much to hide from living. 6 months later, on the rooftop of Harrington Tower at sunset, Marcus knelt with a ring he'd spent 3 months' salary on, not because Elena needed expensive things, but because she deserved something that reflected how he valued her. The sapphire caught the dying light blue as her eyes when she was genuinely happy, rather than performing confidence. She'd been about to ask him something, had mentioned having a question, but he'd beaten her to it with the small velvet box that held everything he wanted their future to be. His voice shook despite his best efforts at steadiness. I was 18 when Ivy was born, thought my life was over. Turns out it was just beginning, leading me to this building, to that morning, to your door. Elena Harrington, will you marry me? Her answer came through tears. Yes, on one condition. His heart stuttered. What? The words transformed everything. We adopt Ivy together officially. I want to be her mother. Really, truly. If she'll have me. Marcus couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, could only nod as tears blurred his vision. They'd been building toward this for months, Elena bonding with Ivy over baking and art projects and bedtime stories becoming part of their small family in ways that felt natural and right. But hearing her say it explicitly, claiming Ivy as hers, choosing them both completely, it broke something open in Marcus that had been locked since Jessica walked away. That evening, they went together to pick up Ivy from Eleanor's apartment, holding hands like teenagers giddy with plans. Ivy saw the rings immediately, her eyes going wide, and they knelt together so they were at her level. Marcus explained that he'd asked Elena to marry him, that they wanted to be a family officially and forever. But then Elena asked her own question, the one that made Ivy's face light up like Christmas morning. Elena's voice trembled with hope. Would it be okay if I became your mom? Officially, adoption papers and everything? Ivy's response came immediate and emphatic. For real, not just daddy's girlfriend. Elena's laugh was half sob. For real, forever. The three of them stood in Eleanor's doorway, holding each other, while the old woman cried happy tears, and Marcus thought about all the moments that had led here, every failure, every struggle, every impossible choice that had seemed like the end, but turned out to be just another step toward this. 1 year later, they married at Seattle Courthouse with Ivy as flower girl, and Harrison walking Elena down the aisle, tears streaming down his face. Marcus's apprenticeship program had trained 47 young electricians, by then giving kids like he'd been a path toward stability. Harrington Tech thrived under Elena's continued leadership, and Ivy declared she wanted to be a veterinarian and a CEO, which Elena assured her was absolutely possible. The best things in life aren't built in boardrooms, Elena said on their wedding night, holding Marcus close while Ivy slept in the next room of their hotel suite. They're built in moments like these. In trust, in love, in family. And Marcus, who'd spent 6 years believing he had lost his chance at happiness, held his wife and thought about his daughter, and knew that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places, from a frosted glass door that swung open at exactly the wrong moment, revealing vulnerability that led to everything right.